My father spent his whole life in the wilderness, and nothing ever scared him. Not wolves, not storms, not the dark. But after the blizzard of 1987, he stopped hunting forever. For 30 years, he refused to explain why. All he ever said was, "Some things out there aren't animals." A few months before he died, he finally told me what followed him home. My father was not the kind of man who believed in ghost stories. He was 6'3", broad-shouldered, and tougher than most men I ever knew. He worked outdoors his entire life, cutting timber, hunting, trapping, and spending nights alone in places where most people would be terrified after sunset. Growing up, I never saw him panic. If the wind howled outside, he said it was just weather. If branches cracked in the dark, he said it was animals. If people talked about spirits in the woods, he laughed and called it superstition. To him, every sound had a reason, every shadow had a source, and every strange story had been exaggerated by frightened people. But something changed during the winter of 1987. After that year, he never hunted again. He sold his traps, locked away his rifle, and refused to enter the forest after dark. Whenever someone asked why, he would only say, "Some things out there aren't animals." The story began in January of 1987 in northern Ontario, during one of the worst winters anyone in that region could remember. Snowdrifts rose higher than trucks, roads disappeared overnight, and temperatures dropped so low that breathing outside felt like swallowing needles. Most people stayed indoors unless leaving was absolutely necessary, but my father had a trap line almost 20 miles from town, and he checked it every winter. It was how he earned extra money. Fox, marten, sometimes lynx. Nothing unusual, nothing dangerous, at least not to him. Before he left, his friend Leonard tried to stop him. Leonard was a Cree elder who had lived in those woods longer than anyone my father knew. He warned him about the storm, but then his voice changed. He said there were older dangers in the forest. He called one of them the hungry spirit, the Wendigo. Dad laughed at first, but Leonard did not smile. He only said, "If you hear someone calling your name in the storm, don't answer." My father ignored the warning. By sunrise the next morning, he had loaded his truck with supplies, checked his rifle, packed food, blankets, fuel, and headed toward the trap line. At first, the drive seemed manageable, but by noon the storm arrived harder than expected. Snow slammed against the windshield so violently that the world ahead disappeared into a wall of white. The road became almost impossible to follow, and more than once, the truck nearly slid into a ditch. Still, Dad kept going. He had driven in bad weather before. He told himself this was just another storm. By mid-afternoon, he reached the cabin, a small hunting shack surrounded by miles of untouched wilderness. There was no electricity, no phone, no neighbors, and no way to call for help if something went wrong. Only trees, snow, wind, and silence. He started a fire, unpacked his supplies, and listened to the storm batter the roof. At that point, he still believed he was alone. The next morning, the blizzard had grown worse. The cabin windows were frosted over, the door was almost buried, and the wind screamed through the trees like something alive. Dad decided it would be safer to wait another day before attempting the drive home. After breakfast, he stepped outside to gather more firewood. That was when he saw the footprints. They began near the tree line and came straight toward the cabin. Human footprints. Barefoot footprints. In snow and ice, in temperatures low enough to freeze exposed skin within minutes. At first, Dad thought someone must be lost. Maybe a hunter. Maybe a snowmobiler. Maybe someone wandering in shock. He followed the tracks carefully. They circled the cabin twice, moving close to the walls, then stopped near the front window. The prints were enormous, almost twice the size of his boots, and spaced impossibly far apart. But the worst part was this: there were no tracks leading away. Dad stood in the snow, staring at those impossible footprints, trying to force his mind into a logical explanation. Maybe the wind had covered the other tracks. Maybe snow had drifted strangely. Maybe he had missed something in the storm. But deep down, he knew none of those answers made sense. The prints were clear. Each toe was visible. Each heel was pressed deep into the snow, as if whatever made them had been heavy, very heavy. He looked toward the tree line, but the forest was still. No birds, no movement, no sound except the wind. A sick feeling settled in his stomach. For the first time, Leonard's warning came back to him clearly. If you hear someone calling your name in the storm, don't answer. Dad returned to the cabin, locked the door, loaded his rifle, and spent the rest of the day watching the windows. As darkness fell, he began telling himself he had overreacted. Then something knocked on the wall. 3 slow taps. The knock came again. 3 deliberate taps against the outside wall of the cabin. Not random branches, not ice cracking, not the wind. Something was touching the wood. Dad raised his rifle and moved toward the window. But when he looked out, he saw nothing except blowing snow. The storm had become so thick that visibility barely reached 20 feet. Then, through the wind, he heard a voice. A woman's voice. Weak, shaking, desperate. Please, it called. Help me. Every instinct in him told him to open the door. If someone was outside in that cold, they would die within minutes. But then the voice came again, closer now, and Dad's blood turned cold. It sounded familiar, too familiar. The woman called his name, Carter. That was my father's name, and the voice belonged to his mother. The problem was, his mother had been dead for 4 years. The voice circled the cabin, begging him to come outside. For nearly an hour, my father sat in that cabin with his rifle pointed at the door while his dead mother's voice called from outside. Sometimes it came from the front, sometimes from behind the cabin, sometimes from the left wall, then suddenly from the right, as if whatever was speaking could move around him without making a sound. It begged. It cried. It whispered memories only his mother should have known. She called him by childhood nicknames no one else used. She asked why he had abandoned her. She said she was freezing. She said she could see him through the window. Dad covered his ears, but the voice kept slipping through the cracks in the wind. He wanted to answer. More than once, he almost did, but Leonard's warning kept repeating in his mind. Don't answer. Don't answer. Don't answer. Then, all at once, the voice stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the screaming storm. Around midnight, Dad heard something heavy land on the roof. The whole cabin shook. Snow slid down past the windows, and the old wooden beams groaned under the weight. Slowly, footsteps moved across the roof from one side to the other. They were too heavy to be a person and too slow to be an animal. Each step pressed down with a deep creak, as if the roof might collapse at any second. Dad sat frozen, staring upward, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped directly above him. Then came a sound he never forgot. Long fingernails scraping across the roof boards. Every instinct told him not to look, but fear and curiosity pulled him toward the window. Slowly, he lifted the curtain and looked upward through the glass. Standing on top of the cabin was a tall, thin silhouette, taller than any man, with limbs too long for its body. Its head turned slowly toward the window, toward him. Dad dropped the curtain and backed away. He did not sleep that night. He sat beside the stove, rifle across his lap, listening to the thing move above him until just before dawn. When the sounds finally stopped, he began searching the cabin for anything useful. The cabin had not originally belonged to him. It had once belonged to an old trapper named Walter Hayes, a man who disappeared decades earlier and was never found. While checking under loose floorboards, Dad discovered an old leather journal hidden beneath a plank. The pages were stiff, yellowed, and smelled of smoke and damp wood. At first, the entries were ordinary: weather, traps, animal signs, supply lists. But near the end, they changed. Walter wrote about something watching him from the trees, something that copied voices, something that sounded wrong at first, but became more perfect every night. The final entry said, "It's learning. Do not follow the voices." After that, the journal ended. The next morning, the storm finally weakened enough for Dad to leave. He packed in silence, keeping the rifle close. refusing to look too long at the tree line. The truck started after several tries, and he drove away from the cabin as fast as the snow-covered trail allowed. For 20 minutes, he believed he might make it home. Then he saw someone standing in the road ahead. A man, motionless, facing away from him, no coat, no hat, no gloves, no footprints around him. Dad slowed the truck, his hands tightening on the wheel. The figure turned slowly. That was when Dad saw its face. It was almost human, but not enough. The mouth stretched too wide. The eyes were black and sunken. The skin looked pulled tight over bone, and somehow from 50 yards away, Dad knew it was smiling at him. Then the truck engine died. The radio exploded into static. The thing took one step forward. Dad turned the key again and again, but the engine would not catch. The figure kept moving closer, not walking normally, but gliding across the snow with long, unnatural steps. The smile never changed. The radio crackled louder until voices began whispering through the static. His mother, Leonard, Walter Hayes. All of them calling his name at once. Dad slammed his fist against the dashboard and twisted the key one last time. The engine roared back to life. He hit the accelerator so hard the truck fishtailed sideways, nearly crashing into the trees. Somehow, he regained control and sped past the figure without looking directly at it. But when he glanced in the rearview mirror, the road behind him was empty. No man, no footprints, nothing. He made it back to town before dark, but the nightmare did not end there, because something had followed him home. For weeks, footprints appeared around his property, and every night, voices whispered from the woods. Years later, after carrying the memory like a sickness inside him, Dad finally went back to Leonard. By then, Leonard was older, thinner, and slower, but his eyes still had that same sharp look, as if he could see through people and into the things they were too afraid to say. Dad found him sitting beside a small fire behind his house, wrapped in a heavy blanket, watching the flames without blinking. For a long time, Dad said nothing. He only stood there with his hands in his coat pockets, trying to find the courage to speak about something he had spent years trying to bury. Then the words came out. He told Leonard everything. He told him about the barefoot tracks in the snow, about the dead voice calling his name outside the cabin, about the heavy footsteps on the roof, and the long claws scraping across the wood. He told him about the figure standing in the road with that almost human face, and the voices whispering through the radio, static. He even told him about the footprints that appeared around his own house after he returned, circling the property night after night, as if something had followed him back from the forest. Leonard listened without interrupting. He did not look surprised. He did not call Dad crazy. He only stared into the fire, his face calm and grave, as if he had been waiting many years to hear this confession. When Dad finally finished, Leonard nodded once and said, "You were lucky." Dad asked him why. Leonard's answer was quiet, "Because it wanted you alive." He explained that the Wendigo did not hunt like a wolf or a bear. It did not simply kill because it was hungry. It fed on fear, loneliness, grief, and despair. It studied people. It learned their voices. It used memories like bait, the voice of a dead mother, the cry of a lost friend, the sound of someone you loved begging for help. It would call from the trees, from the storm, from places where no human being could survive. And once you answered, once you stepped outside, it had you. Dad survived because he never answered. After that, he never returned to the cabin. He never hunted again. 30 years later, on his deathbed, he gave me Walter Hayes' journal. Hidden inside was an old photograph of Walter standing near that cabin. Behind him, among the trees, stood a tall, thin figure. On the back were 5 words. "It followed me home too." If this story made you look twice at the dark woods outside your window, then maybe some part of you already understands the warning. The forest is not always empty, just because you cannot see what is hiding between the trees. Sometimes the wind carries more than snow. Sometimes the voices calling from the darkness know your name, your memories, and the people you miss the most. But not every voice deserves an answer. Some are traps, waiting for one mistake, one moment of weakness, one step beyond the safety of the light. My father survived because he stayed silent, because he remembered Leonard's warning, and because he refused to open the door. Others were not so lucky. So if you ever hear someone calling from the woods when no one should be there, do not speak, do not follow, do not look too long. Subscribe to Taka Tales for more original horror stories and watch the next nightmare on your screen now. But remember, never call back.